Okay, so we're continuing on with this idea of ecological succession. So we talked about ecosystems, right, having some type of event that really disrupts them, basically burns them to the ground or destroys them. And what happens is, after that happens, there is this succession. What happens after some kind of ecological disturbance? And there are these steps that happen that we call the ecological succession. So the primary event is when something happens to remove life from a landscape. So a volcanic eruption covers everything in hot lava, or a meteorite hits the earth. Something where life is completely removed from the environment. What if you have a secondary succession? So some life survives. So you have a fire that burns down most of the grass but not the trees, right? And then what happens after that are these series or stages that follow. Okay? So, for instance, here we have a beach. Let's assume this is Indiana Dunes, because that's exactly what this is. Right on at the shoreline, there's a lot of water and soil being eroded through the waves and the wave action, so there's very little plant life. As you get further back, right, so that's primary. All life is removed, right? There's no plants. You get a little further back, and now you have just grass, because trees that would be there would have been washed out by the waves or the wind, and there's just grass. The further you get from the water, now you have grass, shrubland, and then forest. And these are various series. Let's show you an event right here. Here we have an area, maybe there was something, volcanic eruption. So the area is covered in just rock. And so this is a primary succession. No life is left. We start bare. And over time, we start to see the pioneer species. So first lichens move in, which are small plants and molds that live there. And then they start to colonize in the rocks, and they later on lead to annual plants and small flowers, which then later lead to longer lasting grasses and perennials. Over time, trees begin to grow, and then you end up here at the climax community. And this is, generally speaking, that this environment, once it's left to itself with no more disruptions, this is eventually where it stops changing. So it's kind of the climax of this whole series of steps. What about a secondary succession? Here we have a forest. There's a fire. It burns down most of the trees, but not all of them. It kills most of the plants, but not all of them. There's a little bit left. So the pioneer species maybe start a little bit quicker. So we start right away with the grasses a little sooner, back to that, and then the forest. And you can see these have lengths of time. These may take a while. It may take 100 years for the forest to come back completely. But this climax community, this is just saying that if there were no more disruptions to the environment, to the ecosystem, that this is what would end up, the type of community would you have? Would it be a forest? Would it be a wetland, a swamp? Okay? This isn't always accurate, because very rarely do we ever have an environment where there's no disruption. There's always some kind of disruption, right? Maybe it might be permanent, like volcanoes, but it could just be short term, like a forest fire, okay? And so in reality, these different communities and ecosystems are kind of this mosaic. Some are at their climax, some are not, and some are being reset right now, some were reset last week, some were reset 200 years ago. There's all these different mixes. It's kind of like a mosaic of different communities, okay? So now that we've seen that, we talked about this idea of the biosphere, which is the whole section of the book, and how do we look at it. And we talked about life, and that's part of it. So there's three ways. One way we can organize the biosphere is the Trophic Hierarchy. And this is about energy, right? So remember we talked about in the beginning of the semester that we're going to be mapping how energy flows through matter. When energy flows through life in the form of plants and food, we call that the Trophic Hierarchy. There's this kind of range that we start with sunlight, right? And sunlight is taken by plants, that's the beginning, and this solar energy is turned into the energy, the chemical energy of the plant. The sun takes in, or the plant takes in sunlight. It combines the energy from sunlight with chlorophyll, with carbon dioxide and water, and it creates the cellular material, the sugars that in its plant. So it's taken that energy from the sun and it's made it into something that is chemical energy, right? And then that energy moves through various ways. Other animals eat the plant. Other animals eat that animal. When the plant dies, some animals eat the rotting remains, they decompose it. Or when an animal dies, another animal eats its decomposing remains. And so energy is moved through the ecosystem as well. Okay, so some terms in here: the primary producer. These are the beginning of the trophic chain. Where is energy converted from the sun into something that is physical that animals and plants can use? So producers, the primary producer is usually plants. It does say chemical energy. We're going to talk about that maybe a few chapters down the line. There are a few communities at the bottom of the ocean that rely on chemicals from the Earth's interior as their source of energy, not from the sun. Don't worry about it now. Consumer. So either anything is either a primary producer, it takes this energy from the sun to make its own energy, and then everything else is a consumer. It gets its energy through them. Right? So that could be an animal that eats plants. It could be an animal that eats other animals, right? And then the last part of the chain are the decomposers. So these are the ones that take organic material, whether it was a consumer or a primary producer, and they break it back down into the parts of the soil that the plant used. So this is kind of the beginning of the trophic chain, and this is the end of the trophic system. Now, maybe you've heard of this idea of the food chain, right, in grade school. You have a plant, that's the start of the food chain. An insect eats the plant, and then a bird eats the insect, and then a coyote eats the bird, right? And so you have this straight line, right? But in actuality, nature is never really that simple. It's more of these connections, and they call these food webs. So many things might eat one thing, or many things might eat many things, and they're all connected. And what this does is this maps the flow of trophic energy. So trophic levels just talk about where you are in this food web. Are you a producer? Are you a consumer? Are you high in the chain? Are you low on the chain? You ever heard that, we're top of the food chain, which means that there's nothing that really eats us. We eat everything else, right? That kind of idea. This 10% rule, let me show you what that means. It means that every time you move a level, you only get 10%. So here's what I mean. Here is an example of a food chain / food web. You have your primary producer. So here on the land, it's a plant. And in the ocean, it's phytoplankton, which are basically small, single, one-celled plants that float in the water. So this starts the trophic energy chain, right? So an herbivore, an insect, eats the plants. Here, zooplankton, which are tiny microscopic little sea animals that we don't see unless we have a microscope, right? Now, when we move up here, the energy that was available here from the plant, only 10% of that goes up the food chain. 90% of that energy is lost through various means, which is why one herbivore needs to eat so many plants to make up that energy. Okay? Now you have the next level, secondary consumers. These don't eat the primary, they eat the primary producer, they eat the primary consumer. So larger fish eat the smaller fish. A mouse or a shrew eats the herbivore. You can have tertiary or third level or quaternary, fourth level, right? So all the energy in the trophic system has gone for this bird, a quaternary or fourth level. The first level was the insect, second level it was eaten by the mouse, which was eaten by the snake, which was eaten by the bird. Okay? In the ocean, right, you have the phytoplankton, which is eaten by the zooplankton, which is eaten by a small fish, a bigger fish, and a whale. And here, this would be the top of the food web, or the food chain, because there's really nothing eating these. There might be, but for the most part, they don't. And remember that every level up, right, 10%. That's why a bird needs to eat more than one snake. And so you think about it, this bird is eating maybe 5 snakes, which ate 15, bugs, which ate 3,000 herbivores. So you see that all the time. Here's another way of looking at it, right? You start off here with 100% of the energy, trophic energy, available. The plant has made all this energy. This only gets 10% of it. The rest of it is lost, either the animal by eating, by running, and they get 1%. So you can see that the tertiary consumer actually needs a lot more secondary, primary, and primary producers to move that energy up. In other words, if this only ate one rodent, which ate one grasshopper, which ate one flower, there'd never be enough energy for it to live. It would only have 0.1% of energy. Okay? All right. That's the first way of organizing the biosphere. The second one is the taxonomic hierarchy. In other words, we look at the various animals and plants and all things alive, and we place them in these groups based on their genetics, right? So they're families. So it used to be based on their appearance. All animals that had a backbone, all animals that have 4 legs, all animals that have feathers, right? And this was developed by Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish scientist. And if you've ever heard the species name like Homo sapiens, right? Or an animal's Latin name, Felix, which is the Latin name for cat, that comes from that, okay? And it's this various level of groups. You have families, you have genus, you have species, all this. It's just a way of organizing animals, okay? So for instance, when we say humans, the scientific name for humans is Homo sapiens, okay? So Homo is our genus and sapiens is our species name. Here's a couple examples. All life is life, but we start breaking it down. What domain are they? So there's these different types of domains. Eukarya, right? These are all the things that have a nucleus. There's actually other types of life out there that we don't talk about, like archaea. But this is basically anything with a cell has a nucleus. Then we look at the kingdom. So is an animal. And these are all 3 animals. So animals, there's plants, there's other types. There's actually 5 kingdoms. Then we look at the next thing, the phylum. And this is just another type of family. So all animals in this phylum are chordata, which means they have a spinal cord. Some animals don't. Sometimes we call them invertebrates, like jellyfish, right? But then we have another class. So this is a class of mammalia. These are all mammals. So to be a mammal, there's certain characteristics, right? You have to have fur. You have to have the ability to make milk for your young, right? Those kind of things. And then the next thing is the order of primates. This is an order, so now we break down mammals. And here we see that humans and chimpanzees are still in the same order, primates. And primates basically means that you have hands with fingers, stuff like that. But here we have cetacea, right? And the difference here, dolphins don't have legs. They don't have arms. They have flippers, but now they're in a different order. Then family. So primates include this, but in the family they're even closer. So in the family of Hominidae, these are animals that have a larger brain, have a higher intelligence, a much more involved social group. So we have the same family. But dolphins are a family of cetacea. So dolphins are the same order as whales, but not the same family. I know this gets complicated. And then we get into the genus, and this is a much more narrow thing. And here we have Homo, and here we have Pan. And animals that are Homo we're the only species left. There used to be more, like Neanderthals. But Homo, if you're in the genus Homo, you are a homine that walks upright, only on 2 legs. Whereas chimpanzees only do that once in a great while, so they are Pan. And then here we have Turrisops, which is a different type of family. And then lastly, the individual species. So Homo sapiens. We are the only species of human that is currently in existence. 50,000 years ago, they were Homo Neanderthals, Homo Denisovians, right? So there were other species of humans. There are other species of chimpanzee. There's Pan Paniscus, which is the bonobo, and then there's another one, which is the chimpanzee. So these are all just various classifications. Okay. Now, we can look at the traits that are used to create these. So homologous traits are those traits that they share in similarity. So for example, birds have feathers. They all share this trait. All bats have hair. All fish have gills. That kind of a thing. Okay. Analogous traits, we don't really use these. These are things that don't reflect genetic similarities. So wings, because bats and birds both have wings, but they develop differently. And so the fact they have, we don't use this to classify. We don't use flying as a classification. Okay. So example here, the thing, bats' wings are really just their fingertips. So this is the arm of the bat. This is where its hand would be, and these are what we would call finger bones. And this is just like having webbed fingers, right? Whereas a bird, right? The bird's actually right here, it's still that arm bone, but these aren't fingers, right? The feathers actually come off of the arm. So think about a chicken wing, right? Their bones are all together, not like a bat. And then the last way, and I know this is a long section, we're at 15 minutes, but this is the last way. The last way we can organize the biosphere is by the spatial hierarchy, which is simply this. You have individuals, like this one little mouse, right? But a bunch of individuals make up a population. So all the mice that live in Illinois, okay? Now, or all the mice that live in maybe your backyard, maybe a smaller population. But then you can look at the community and ecosystem. So all the mice that live in North America, right? And that's an ecosystem. All the mice, that's one population of individuals. You could also look at in there also in the ecosystem all the populations or communities of plants and grasses and birds and fish. And all these together make ecosystems. Ecosystems combine to create the biome. So this might be northern Wisconsin, but this biome of the prairie is the whole mixed, the amount of all these communities together. And then if you add up all the biomes, you have the biosphere, right? And the biosphere is just all the areas of life. So I'm going to leave it for now because we're getting kind of long at 15 minutes. I'm going to pause right here. We'll come back and we'll finish up this chapter.